off camera right now, but he'll be here in a second. We are going to be focusing on landlords, tenants, and the rental world. The reason we're doing this is because many of the emerging agents that I'm talking to, this is part of their business. This is someone that has their hand up and wants help. And there was a time that maybe an agent would be like, oh, I'd never work with renters. Why wouldn't you? They have their hand up, they're interested in home ownership, and if you're the one that helps them find their apartment, you know when their lease is up. Which means that 9 months in advance, you're checking in with them and asking them what's the most annoying thing about their apartment. And then at 8 months, you're reaching out and you're like, you know, I just did this really interesting training and it was reminding people how important their credit score is. What's your credit score? How's it looking? Remember that annoying neighbor from last month? Let's get you out of there. And then you have the ability to be moving them from rental to buyer. So there's a reason that a lot of people are working with people that have their hands up right now. Money is a little more expensive for some people. So maybe they thought this was their year to move, but the reality is it might be 2027. Why wouldn't you continue that relationship, work with them as a renter, and then help convert them to a buyer? So this is an opportunity, and because so many people had questions, I really wanted to get the #1 guy in front of the room to kind of talk us through all of this, because having insight and answers ahead of mistakes is always helpful. This is Andrew. When he comes up, he is our broker. We should talk to him. If you have questions, talk to him. Do not be afraid of him. He is not a terrifying person. He is a knowledge bank. He's going to smile and explain and help you pivot and grow your business every day towards more professionalism. So don't be afraid. That's why we're going to bring him up and kind of talk about it. If anybody needed, we have these documents in our computers or in Dotloop, but if anybody needed a paper copy.
And
Thank you.
if you have that checklist in front of you, there's some things on there that don't need to be on there anymore, and there's some things that aren't on there that probably should be on there. Because as Kelly mentioned, like this is becoming a more normal thing than it was 4 or 5 years ago. So it's not really something that we have dealt with recently until the last probably 6 months. So we're going to talk about dealing with landlords as well as tenants. We'll cover both. The tenant side's really pretty simple. Not a whole lot to, on a technical basis, to be ready for or anything. But on the landlord side, there is. So we'll spend more time on the landlord side than on the tenant side. So first question that people usually have about representing a tenant is whether you need representation agreements or not, especially since none of you have had a license at a time when you didn't need a representation agreement with a buyer or a seller. The assumption would be you need one with a tenant. I would say you don't need one, but it's a good idea to do it. There's nothing about the NAR settlement that caused buyer representation agreements to be required. Talks at all about representing a tenant. But state law says if you're going to represent a tenant that's going to sign a lease for more than 18 months, write that down, 18 months. And I would say 18 months or more, not more than 18 months. Then you do need a representation agreement. State law also says when it comes to representation agreements that you only need them at the time of making an offer. So it wouldn't be something you need up front. I would encourage you to do it up front, just to have a process where you're getting representation agreements and consumer guides signed at the same time with every person you work with, whether it's a tenant, a buyer, or a seller, or a landlord, all four, I guess. Because I'll tell you, just across the board, consumer guides is the one thing that gets charged on the most by the Division of Real Estate for violations. So good idea to be getting that signed. We have to get that signed up front, so you might as well get a representation agreement signed as well. Is everybody, when I say representation agreement, is everybody familiar with what I'm talking about? Yeah? Maybe not. Just basically an agreement saying like, and we have a tenant rep agreement, this isn't something you have to make, but just an agreement that says like, you want to look for a rental, you want me to help you do that. So for a time period, we're gonna do that together, and if you find a place, I'm gonna get paid a commission of X. Whatever that is, right? There's some other language in there, obviously, but the basics is that.
For the consumer guide, is that the same one we would use for if we work with a buyer?
Yeah, that's that buyer, seller, tenant, landlord, same exact document all the time. Because that's just a very basic document that's truly just written by the state of Ohio. Like that's not our document. There's a handful of versions of it depending on what types of agency relationships you're allowed to have at a given brokerage. But basically like, I go on the state site, tell them what kind of agency relationships we operate with here, and then it gives me the document. So that document's not special in any way relative to any one party you'd be working with. And again, super important you're getting that signed by anybody you're working with at the outset of your relationship. So that's why you might as well get tenant agreements signed as well. So, but it's, like I said, not required. So I think the one thing that could easily happen here is you get a phone call from somebody that wants to look at these two places that their friend who rents from the same landlord wants to go look at, but they want to do it with you. You may not get a representation agreement signed in that scenario, because it may be like if they don't rent either of those places, they're not going to do anything. Okay, whatever, not the end of the world. Other thing that needs to get signed early when you're actually like writing an offer for a rental is the agency disclosure document. So agency disclosure gets used with rentals just like it does on a purchase. The document that just says who's working for who. So our document doesn't say buyer/tenant. I feel like it did many years ago, but the state has adjusted that form a few times, and the one we use today just says buyer. That's okay, don't worry about that. Still use it. It also just says seller instead of landlord. It used to literally say seller/landlord, but again, that's a state document. It's not one that we create.
All right, so just again, same documents that we use, we continue to use even in this. We are always going to be talking about agency. We are always going to be talking about who's working for who. It's out of lack of clarity that people have questions and then start to have big feelings. So we want to be really clear and candid. And these are documents you're very familiar with already. But we always want to make sure we're doing it. This is always the first step. This is who's working with who, and this is what it looks like.
Yeah, and like the title of it is disclosure. You would never disclose something to somebody after the fact, right? So the idea of like signing an agency disclosure after the deal's done because you forgot it, probably just as good as having not signed it at all. So that's why it's important that gets signed at the outset when you're filling out that document that is not on this checklist, I don't believe. No, no, that is, but the other one, which is not on here, that probably should be, is the, Kate, remind me of the actual name of that, like the offer document? Agreement to enter into a lease. So it's like an agreement to agree, right? Because realize like we don't have the lease. It's not like a purchase where we have the contract where we're gonna fill out a purchase agreement. In this scenario, like the landlord has the contract, if we have the tenant, we don't have the contract. So we have a document called an agreement to enter a lease that basically lays out all of the terms of a lease, which would be what? What would be the terms of a lease?
Address,
Length,
amount,
Security deposit.
yes. And then the last thing, because we're representing them, would be commission. Yeah. Like, so that's what's on that document. It's a really basic document. It's like a letter of intent type of thing, but it's your way of writing an offer to a tenant, or to a landlord rather, right? So that document, again, not currently on this checklist as a required document. I understand why, because it's not a binding document in any way. So it wouldn't be necessary, but the lease agreement is the final thing that really shows here's what's happening. But that's probably one that we want to add to the checklist, because the one thing that's on that document that the landlord signs is the commission. And that's probably not going to be in the lease. Commission piece. So probably a good idea for that to be in there. Lead-based paint disclosures, same rules as a sale. If the place is older than 1978, there should be a lead-based paint disclosure filled out by the landlord, signed by the tenant. So also their same rule applies about the EPA pamphlet. So that should be provided to anybody who's renting a place that's older than 1978 as well.
Do you recommend that we put an initial box on that, or is just sharing it through Dotloop with the disclosure enough?
Well, I mean, if you read the whole thing that the buyer initials on the lead-based paint disclosure, they're initialing saying they've received it.
Mm-hmm.
So they've already initialed saying they've received it.
Okay.
And so then the only problem is if we don't have any documentation that we provided it, then I've never seen this be a problem, but there's a first time for everything. So just share it. It's one of those things, like it's easy enough to share inside of Dotloop. It's not like because it's kind of a clunky document, but you know, you're just clicking a box and sharing it along with the lead-based paint disclosure and the agreement to enter into a lease when you're writing that offer, right, along with the agency disclosure. Copy of commission check is on that checklist. Don't know why. Wouldn't really need to be an item, because we would have the check, so we really wouldn't need a copy of it. So that's probably not as necessary. Let's talk about though collecting commission on the rental side. There's not necessarily a right way to do it. I would say there's a best way to do it, but it doesn't always work out that way. But realize like there's no title company involved. There's nobody like standing between the landlord and their money to make sure that we get paid. So in a perfect world, when you put the lease together and like that like transfer of dollars is similar to like a closing on a purchase when the title company hits the button and wires money everywhere. Like that's the end of the transaction. Same thing with a lease. The end of the transaction is just the tenant providing funds that the lease requires. And at that point, like there's a possession agreement inside of the lease, but that's the end of the transaction, right? So in a perfect world, what would happen is that we would get a check directly from the tenant that the landlord would acknowledge as part of the first month's rent or all of the first month's rent or however, whatever we're getting paid. So it kind of depends on what you're getting paid, but that you would just get a really generic acknowledgement from the landlord. It could just be a blank addendum that says that they agree that you've been paid X out of the first month's rent. Kind of acknowledging that the tenant paid it, right? So, and that way, like we're getting paid by our own client with the landlord's money, as opposed to the tenant pays the landlord, and then we have to chase the landlord around for the check.
So at the end, the landlord is who pays?
The landlord's money pays, yeah, but so if we get it from our tenant, it's money that the tenant owed the landlord, that they paid us instead of paying the landlord.
So who are they making the payment payable to? If it's a tenant, I mean, typically it's the landlord, right?
But in this case, what I'm saying, the landlord would agree that the tenant's paid Keller Williams Greater Metropolitan X in lieu of paying rent.
So for example,
'Cause
like
that would
a
be
security
their rent.
deposit, like if they're writing a security deposit check, they could write that payable to KWGM instead of the
Security
landlord?
deposits are like a holy grail, so no,
Okay.
not security
First
deposit,
month's rent,
Yeah.
first month's rent, so
Yeah,
like
yeah, because
okay.
security deposit theoretically belongs to the tenant still, it's just in the landlord's possession.
Yeah,
But the rent is the tenant's.
okay.
So like literally, let's just generically say you're getting paid a whole month's rent. That might not be normal, but let's just, for easy math, let's say that's what it is. And the rent is $1,200, and the security deposit's $1,200. Normally, like in a transaction where just it's all gonna go to the landlord, the tenant ought to be writing two checks, one that makes it very clear that it's a security deposit, and another that makes it very clear it's the first month's rent. And then the landlord would write us a check. What I'm saying, the problem with that is, we chase a lot of landlords for money that we don't even ever get. Because what are we gonna do? We're gonna go sue somebody for $800. It's just, it's not feasible, right? So in that scenario, it would be far better to have the tenant write a check to the landlord for $1,200 and write a check to us and have the landlord acknowledge that the $1,200 check to us was July 1st rent, whatever, based on whatever the lease is. So that there's some acknowledgement that then they can't come back and say like, hey, you never even paid the first month's rent, now here we are in the second month and you're late, I'm gonna start evicting you. Right, so you want some acknowledgement of that, but that would be the easiest way to collect that commission. Or it just, all the money goes to the landlord and then the landlord's writing Keller Williams Greater Metropolitan a check for the commission that was agreed to on that agreement to enter into a lease.
Any questions around that? The first time I did it, and I mean, I've done this too. People come to you when you're the real estate professional that people know you might be asked about this. It felt really clunky. I kept asking Kate, and I was like, are you sure this is really how I'm supposed to do it? But that is the best way to do it. And I just explained it that way, practice the conversation, and next time. So just let them know that's coming. When you're signing that agreement, just like you let buyers know these are the next steps, let the tenant know. When it comes to my commission, it is typically this amount in the agreement, and how we get to that point is you'll write 2 checks, one to my brokerage, one to the landlord. We're gonna do an addendum, they're gonna sign it. Don't worry, this is how we're gonna do it. Like letting them know that it's coming, because they're also going to be talking to the landlord who's like, give me all your money, 1 check, da-da-da. So you want to set the cadence and set the tone.
Well, in a scenario where you're dealing directly with
Yeah.
the landlord, you would just have this conversation with the landlord, like after you had the agreement to enter into a lease figured out. You'd say, okay, like next step is we need your lease. And here's what we'll do, as we sign the lease, we'll get you the security deposit, this is how we'll handle commission. Like, if there's not another agent on the other side, which a lot of times there's not. Sometimes there will be, but a lot of times you're gonna have found a place that's just for rent with the landlord. And so you're gonna be dealing directly with the other party as opposed to another agent.
Have you ever run into an issue where the landlord was like, no, I'm not paying you commission because this is,
I mean, normally you run into that when you call them to sell it, when you call them to show it rather.
okay,
Like if you're calling to say, hey, I've got a tenant that I'm working with, I'd love to show your place. And then you've already worked out with your tenant, if they're the ones paying you, or if the landlord's paying you. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the tenant paying, that happens.
and that was gonna be my question. So for instance, I had a renter who was looking for an apartment for $750 a month. And I showed him the property, he did not like it. But the way that I explained it to him was that he would pay the first month's rent and security deposit of the $1,300 or whatever it was gonna end up being for the apartment, but then he was also going to pay me $650 separately as my fee. So that way the landlord wasn't out anything, his first month was paid, there was no bad blood. Is that an option to just
Yeah,
let
no, it's no different than your
the
buyer
tenant
paying commission instead of the seller paying it. I mean, it's
Okay,
same idea. Yeah.
so the tenant is allowed to pay the brokerage directly outside of,
And I'll tell you, in markets where realtors represent tenants 50 or 70% of the time, in a place like places like
Chicago.
New York and Chicago, and places like that, most of the time in those places, the tenant pays at the first appointment.
okay.
They're just like, here's this, it's not even a retainer, it's just this is what the cost is.
Yeah.
And like, we're gonna collect our commission up front instead of down the road. You guys could do that too if you really wanted to. I don't imagine it would go over real well, but
Yeah.
you could.
I can see it being a big market here though. I mean, because you're right, Chicago, New York, where it seems like it'd be a lot more difficult to find an apartment, but in, you know, Northeast Ohio, you don't sell apartment in Ohio. You know, it's pretty easy. So
Yeah.
I guess I'm just curious how common this is in our area.
Not necessarily, it's not very common.
Yeah.
I think the places where it can be common are, like, primarily out of towners. So like, every March, a whole bunch of people find out that they're gonna need to be in Cleveland by June.
Yeah,
And 2/3 of those people are gonna rent a place.
yeah.
And they don't know anything about anything. So they can look on Zillow and see like, oh, there's this great house for only $950 a month, and it's only a half a mile from the Cleveland Clinic.
Yeah.
And they don't know what they're getting into or not getting into, right? So like, I think that, like, that's a person that would happily, like, show up in town, pay somebody $1,000 to be their agent, and by the end of the weekend, have, 4 or 5 places that they're happy to write offers on and try to get a lease. So I think there's moments in time where you could probably have 5 or 6 tenants that you represent over the course of 45 days. And then, but yeah, if you're dealing with like a person from Cleveland that's looking to move out of their smaller apartment into a bigger apartment, yeah, they probably don't need me.
Now, to get the kind of business Andrew was talking about, let's like have a little session quickly. Universities, hospitals, higher ed, school systems, all of those bring people from other areas quickly and need to have housing figured out, and most of them, depending, like Kent State, they usually recommend you start with a housing that's temporary until you figure out your placement, things like that. So having my friend Andrew that works administration at Kent State for new acquisitions, just keeping that relationship alive, there might be this steady stream of September moves, December moves, and then again, you know details about them, and it becomes really easy to get them into their database to convert them to a buyer when they're ready. So when you are sitting here thinking, I need to get some new business, here's some creative other ways that you can within the bounds of your license.
Yeah, I would argue even if you made a YouTube video about neighborhoods with lots of rental opportunities once every 2 weeks, by next April, you'd be a person showing up when somebody's Googling, like trying to find a rental in Cleveland, just because you would have made 10 or 12 videos by then.
Is there a link, because I actually do own a house that, I utilize for that same purpose, right? So I know that, doctors, fellows, all those come in June typically. Furnish Finder, that's actually probably the best resource that I've found. Is there a link between KW and Furnish Finder, or is there just curious?
No, there's not. And I think like that's Furnish Finder is maybe for people who are gonna land and don't have the intention of staying there permanently, but like wanna stay somewhere for 3 months or 6 months before they like figure out the permanent either rental or purchase. But I mean, I've been doing this a long time, and a long time ago I used to do a ton of incoming doctor business, and back then they all bought, and now they don't. But back in like 2012 and 13 and 14, like they all bought, because it was cheaper to buy than it was to rent, and there was plenty of choices available, and it was easy enough to show up for a weekend and go home with a signed contract, right? Which is a little hard to do back then. So more of them are going to be looking to rent than buy it, especially because now, I mean, to buy a decent house in Cleveland Heights, you're not going to have a mortgage payment under $2,500, especially if you're financing 100% of the purchase price. So if they want to show up and want to pay $1,500, like there's zero chance they're going to be buying a house, right? And I don't know how much a resident makes today. I'm sure it's more than they did 12 years ago, but they're not making $100 grand.
No,
They're lucky to make probably 70. I don't know what they make today. They used to make about 50, but that was 10 years ago at least. Yeah. So repeat back to me, what are the documents you want to get signed by a tenant within like before you get started working with them or when you meet with them to get started? What do we need to get signed? Consumer guide?
Yes.
Agency disclosure.
Agency disclosure is going to wait till there's a property,
Oh.
because that's specific to that property, so that you know like if there's a listing agent or not, if you're the only agent involved, or if there's 2 agents involved, that type of stuff, or if you're a dual agent, if they end up renting a place that you have listed as a rental.
And that was another thing, like when I'm showing rental properties, I mean, there's dozens of rental property addresses. So like when filling out some of the forms, I was just putting TBD in the address spot.
Which form are you referring to that has an address spot?
Not on here. It was this. So the prospective tenant questionnaire, I was having them kind of fill out the information ahead of time and just putting TBD in the property spot.
Well, yeah, there'd be no property if you're meeting with them and it's a questionnaire about what they're looking for. Then, at that point that would be like an intake form.
Basically.
So yeah, there'd be no need for a property, sure. But yeah, an agency disclosure, like in order for there to be agency relationships to disclose, there's got to be a property. Because if there's no property, you have no idea who the other party is or isn't represented by, that type of thing. Same thing, like think about on a purchase, like you wouldn't sign an agency disclosure ahead of time because you don't even know who the other agent is, or not, or if you're the other agent potentially, like I said, if it's a delinquency situation. But we've got the consumer guide, what else?
Representation agreement if it's 18 plus 1.
Yeah, and I would argue like, you might as well just sign a representation agreement. There's no downside to signing one. Worst case scenario is you sign one and you guys end up falling out and not talking much and they just break it. And you don't even know they broke it because you're not following up with them. Doesn't really matter at that point. But so there's no downside to getting one signed, so I would say it's a good idea to do it. Because also somebody might be looking for a 12-month lease and then you stumble on a place that the landlord says like, hey, they'll do it for $150 less a month if you sign a 24-month lease. And then you completely forgetting about the fact that you don't have a representation agreement signed, move on, sign a 24-month lease, and now you've broken the law.
And it isn't always Andrew that smiles and tells you that. Marcia that sends you the email for compliance is not smiling like Andrew is.
Now, before we move on to landlords, does anybody have any questions around process, documents, just good practices?
I got a question. Is Section 8 the same way with the same documents? We do the same way?
Yeah, because I mean, Section 8 is an agreement between the landlord and the tenant. It has nothing to do with us. Still, like if you were finding a place that accepted Section 8, where the tenant was going to be using Section 8, at the end of the day, they're still just signing a lease with the landlord. It's just that the landlord has to comply to certain things. So I would be very careful getting involved with representing people on Section 8 only because that turns into a lot of times a very long process that can be hard for it to be worth your effort probably to like stay in front of it long enough, because most of the time, not all the time, but most of the time, that like the moment they find a property, it's anywhere between 30 and 120 days before it's actually, the whole thing is approved by Section 8 and you have the opportunity to even sign a lease. And it just, so I think like, that could be tough. I'm not gonna just totally discourage you from doing it, just know that there's an uphill climb there. And back to like the question about viability of a person using an agent. Section 8, like there's, like most people looking for a Section 8 apartment are going on like the CMHA list of like, they know the properties, they don't really need our help very much, unfortunately, I would say. So, but you could do it. You sure, and it wouldn't, on our end, it wouldn't require anything different.
Now, but that market is a wonderful place for you to show up for buyer representation and as a realtor of choice and as a as a reference point. So I have, and he's right, it's a long process that fills your heart and feels wonderful. It's a long process. But that connection has gotten me into the room with people that are part of the home buying process through Section 8. Because there are programs for that also. And if you become the real, because agents, if they don't show up to take care of them as a tenant, they're not showing up as a buyer either. You're there in the room. So even if maybe working with a Section 8 renter isn't the leg of a business you want to truly build, being in front of those people, it fills your heart. They appreciate the work. They want to know, and it is a game changer when you hand the keys to someone that is breaking generational rental history. So don't run away from them. Just figure out a way to make that part of your real estate business outside of the rental, because that is a wonderful thing. And those housing affiliation groups have a hard time finding realtors that will come and talk, because it's a great place for you to show up.
One thing I think if that's a road you're gonna go down, talk to Debbie and Megan at our management company, because they would be able to make sure that you clearly understand the process that the tenant and the landlord have to go through to get to the top of the mountain and have a lease that will be accepted on a property that will be accepted by Section 8. Because I think if you don't know anything about that process, you would not be helpful to the game, right? But if you do know a lot about that, you also might be helpful to that tenant that's like, looking to rent this place with this landlord, and that landlord's saying like, yeah, we would do it, and you're looking at it going like, I don't think this is gonna end well, because I know A, B, and C have to all happen and fall into place, and none of those things exist at this property, and this thing has been sitting here for 10 months empty or whatever, and then you start to gather like, this person hasn't worked it out with Section 8 in the past, they're probably gonna continue to not, so like, do you, my client, wanna wait through a 90-day process that may end with just like, it's not gonna work out. So, but you have to be an expert in that process to be able to do that with somebody, right?
I have one more question.
Yeah,
So in this process, whether it be Section 8 or otherwise, is there a due diligence process that we as agents would do on the tenant? Meaning the rentability, meaning credit, background, any of that information, or are we relying on their word and then just finding them then a property?
No,
and
you
then allowing
certainly-
that landlord to then process, whatever their process
so
is.
in the end, most of the time, the landlord's not gonna accept whatever information you've generated. They're usually gonna go through their own application process anyway. But no, there'd be nothing wrong with like, you guys could all set up a Tenant Magic account for free that doesn't cost anything, then like the tenant pays when they get the link to fill out the application. So you could have like just a dummy property in there that you just set up applicants who would be people that wanna work with you as a tenant, right? And then they just pay the $30 or whatever it costs, I think, and then you'd have a portable application that you could provide, but it at the very least would also show you, like, no different than having them call Sean or somebody else to get pre-approved so that you know, like, all right, if we're gonna go shopping for a house, we all know where we stand and we can make it happen, right? But so Tenant Magic is the best thing I could think of, because I don't even know that you could do it through like the Zillow applications without actually like having a property on Zillow that you're paying monthly for to have on there.
Well, I do use Zillow and it's free, and you can put another property on there.
And just leave it on there?
Yeah, I have a few on there. I mean, they're inactive now, but they will allow you, and you're right, it's like $30 for,
Yeah.
if you just send the email to
Yeah.
them or
Yeah.
whatever.
You have to
But
pay.
you call it tenant.
Tenant Magic, so the website's just tenantmagic.net, I believe. It's a local company, it's a guy named Jay Apple, I don't think he lives in Shaker Heights, but it's like a national thing, it's not just a Cleveland thing, but it just so happens he's a local guy. But that's the one that I've used in the past. I've used Zillow more recently just cause like the people are using Zillow. So like if the listing is on there, you just start getting applications,
Yeah.
right? But that's a new thing on Zillow just in the last, I don't know, couple of years.
It is,
You didn't
yeah.
used to get applications from there, you just.
It's actually
marketed.
really convenient.
So-
It's nice, they have like
Yeah.
reports and everything.
I got a question about the Zillow application. How does that work? So if you get a tenant, I get somebody that wanna, go through me to get a rental. Do I have them do an application on Zillow and then just go from there?
You could, it's news to me that you can keep the property on there for free long term. And I feel like that's something that they've gone back and forth on, so it might be something you could do today and not something that you could do
Absolutely.
a year from now.
Okay.
I feel like a few years ago, when I listed a place on Zillow, it charged me $10 a month. And then the most recent one I did last year on Zillow, it didn't charge me, so who knows? They could change that any day. But Tenant Magic, it's free to have an account.
Okay.
And then you're just basically going into your account and you just have a fake property in there.
Mhm.
Because the only reason you have a property in there is so that if you had 10 rentals, that you'd have like people that applied for this one, not just applications in general. So that's the only reason you have a property in there. They don't care about the property. It could just be a made up address, I think. But then you can send that link anytime you want. And they just have to put like debit or credit card information in order to fill out the application. So, let's talk about tenants or landlords for a minute. I don't know, is anybody getting that business or trying to get that business? Let me ask that question first.
I'm a landlord.
Get one, okay.
I am.
Well, maybe you'll learn some things that'll keep you out of trouble.
Yeah.
So on the landlord side, first there's a short caveat here, like we have some specific things we have to do as a brokerage due to some past problems. But, so you have to, if you're gonna represent a landlord, the listing agreement has to come from Julia, you're not gonna find that in Dotloop or anywhere else.
And it
there's
comes with
that.
special verbiage that we are supposed to use.
Yeah,
That's
so,
why you can't find it. They want to make sure that you do it the right way.
well, there's some things we've agreed to that force us to put some specific language in the listing. But at the end of the day, with tenants or with landlords, again, just like a tenant is pretty much like a buyer, a landlord's pretty much like a seller. So you need a listing agreement, you need a consumer guide at the outset, just like you need a representation agreement and a consumer guide at the outset for a buyer or a tenant, right? So same thing, you need those two things to start. That gives you the ability to list the property now. Okay, property's on the market. Couple of things that you cannot do, no matter what the landlord asks of you, is we cannot specifically market anything relating to the lack of subsidized programs. So if the landlord ultimately doesn't want to rent to somebody with any kind of subsidized program, whether that be Section 8 or Eden or any kind of other local city programs or anything like that, we can't stop them, but we can't be a part of like specifically marketing against that and ultimately turning people down for that, right? So that's thing number one. I mean, at this point, probably about 75% of the properties that you would show for rent in Cuyahoga County are in cities that don't allow the landlord to discriminate against income source, and vouchers are considered an income source. So that's first issue, just to make sure you're aware of, so you're not getting yourself in trouble or your landlord in trouble. Secondly is there's three different types of animals. There's pets, there's support animals, and there's service animals. The only one the landlord can discriminate against is pets. And the landlord can discriminate any way they want against pets. There's no protection for pets whatsoever. As soon as it's deemed to be some kind of a support or service animal, which service animals really in our marketplace can only be dogs. But support animals could be anything. And they could get a letter from some joker in California or wherever, Alaska or anywhere else, saying that like so-and-so needs this support parrot or whatever, doesn't matter what it is. We can't say no to that, unfortunately. It seems weird to me that a person that owns a property can't be the determiner of what is or isn't allowed in there completely, but like, that's the case. So it's important that you understand that, because like I guess just one, the last of the civil rights problems that we've had as a brokerage were tied to just kind of like lumping pets and support animals into the same category and then wanting to charge for them and things like that, and you just can't do that.
You can't charge an extra security deposit even for a support animal?
No.
Really? Now that's
No.
interesting. And does it have to be legitimately registered? Or can they just say, this is my support?
You're allowed to ask for documentation. The only time you're not allowed to ask for documentation is if the reason is plain and obvious. So you can't ask a blind guy for documentation. So anytime that the disability is obvious, you're not allowed to ask any questions. But yeah, if I walk into a place to rent and I say I've got this 75-pound dog that's my support animal, like you're allowed to ask me for documentation. But that documentation is very easy to get. So that's the place where it's pretty gray. Is there's no real rules about what is or what you have to evidence to need a support animal, right? So, but yeah, so what that turns into is a weird game of like kind of how you're evaluating people. That again, like it's unfortunate because all it does is force a whole bunch of weird discrimination like underground instead of just allowing it to be above board. But that's what it turns into, unfortunately. But so those are things that you have to be clear about with your landlord up front. That like, hey, we're not going to be able to do this, and we're not going to be able to do this, and you need to do this. That like, if I'm a landlord and I don't have a real estate license, and I do those things, like I still may end up at the Civil Rights Commission and have a problem. But it's a very different problem than it is for a person with a license, right? Because we're deemed to be to know what's appropriate and what's not. Where the landlord can go and just be like, I wasn't aware of that, and then really should. And that's the end of it. So beyond that stuff, everything else is just the same as it is on the tenant side. You're still gonna end up with needing a copy of the lease. You're still gonna end up most likely with some kind of agreement to enter into a lease that's probably coming from somebody else. So those things are all kind of the same. So really the most important things are gonna be the same things on either side, which is the two things you need early, and then an agency disclosure and a lead-based bank disclosure, and then that lease. That's really it. There's nothing too complicated here, I don't think. Any other questions about kind of how to just like practice questions as opposed to form questions of documents and things like that?
What do you typically charge a landlord?
I mean,
It's the same.
the old like 6% rule in the rental world was a month's rent. I mean, that was what was fairly normal if you're charging a landlord, and then that kind of assumed in most cases, just like listing commissions used to assume, then you were splitting that with another agent. So about a half month's rent would have been fairly normal to represent one side of a transaction.
I just have a question about the agreement to enter into a lease. So if you're representing a landlord, you have to get this filled out by the person who's the tenant, or?
Not necessarily. If you're not representing the tenant, like you could, just like you could fill out a purchase agreement for a buyer when you're not representing them. Like there's nothing wrong with that. You could, if you want to use that as just like your like kind of verbal negotiation process.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, that person is just going to end up signing your client's lease.
Okay.
So you could just like verbally have that conversation and then just move into the lease and just sign the lease. Because really, the agreement to enter into a lease is a completely non-binding document.
Okay.
Right? So it doesn't really matter. It's only there as your communication tool when you're representing the tenant.
So if you represent the landlord, then they have to get their lease agreement filled out by the tenant instead? Okay.
Yeah, a lot of times it's gonna go through your hands.
Okay.
Like if you're representing either the landlord or the tenant, you may be given that document and then you put it in Dotloop or whatever you're using and
then you send it to the
you
tenant.
get it all.
So that's really
filled out and stuff.
that's really the only thing that's different then between if you get on the buyer side or the landlord side?
I mean, on the buyer side, you're just receiving that document
Right.
versus if you're on the landlord side, you would still be receiving it, but just from your own client and then pushing it out there. We're never gonna supply a lease to a landlord.
Okay.
When we represent the landlord, that
Okay.
there's too much legal liability
Okay.
in that. So yeah, I don't have any great advice anymore about where to even go to get a lease. You used to be able to get them from like the Ohio Bar Association, but I don't even think that they'll provide them anymore.
Zillow has them.
Ugh.
So basically they have to
I
have
don't
their
use
own-
it, but it does have a lot of
You
laws
need a
on it.
lawyer to write.
I mean, normally that's what
Yeah.
you would do. I think for the landlord with one rental, I think is weirded out by the idea of that. I mean, if you have 8 or 10, then it makes total sense. You'd have one and it's just your lease and you may make updates to it every few years based on the thing that burned you last year. Right? But
Yeah.
So if you do have one, like a person who has one property and you're representing that as a landlord, if they're asking you about a lease agreement, where would you direct them?
You
I guess?
need a lawyer.
either a lawyer or, I mean, like I said, I don't even know. I haven't looked recently. You used to be able, you could get a generic one on the Ohio Bar Association website, but I doubt you can anymore.
No, you need a lawyer.
No.
Lawyer to write, and then you, like you say, you keep using that.
Yeah, because once you have it,
Yeah.
you're probably gonna, I mean, I can't think of the last time I actually have paid a lawyer to change my lease, but, so yeah, and it's been the same one for a decade. So, but yeah, that's always like, people expect that we're gonna have a lease for them. That's not the way it works. Anything else? Okay,
All right.
I think we've done it, Kelly.
We have. Woo! Another video for the library. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.